I was there when we were gods. Let me tell you what that means, truly means, to have stood in the light of an age so golden that its memory burns like fire in the minds of those who lived through it, who witnessed its glory and its promise, and the absolute certainty that humanity was ascending toward a destiny that would eclipse the stars themselves. I am custodian. I am one of the 10,000, the companions of the Emperor, the golden warriors who have guarded his light since before the Imperium had a name. I have walked beside him through corridors that no longer exist, have heard his voice speaking words that have been forgotten by all but a handful of souls who still draw breath, have witnessed the full arc of humanity's greatest triumph and its most catastrophic fall. I am old beyond the reckoning of ordinary men, my existence measured not in years but in ages, and I carry within me memories that would crush lesser minds beneath their weight. I will tell you the story of the Horus Heresy. I will tell you how we fell. But first, you must understand what we were before the falling, what heights we had climbed, what wonders we had achieved, what absolute and unshakable confidence we possessed in the righteousness of our cause and the inevitability of our victory. You cannot comprehend the depths of the tragedy without first grasping the heights from which we plummeted, cannot feel the full weight of our loss without knowing what we possessed before it was torn from our hands by treachery and madness and the hungry gods that dwell beyond the veil of reality. The Great Crusade had lasted for 2 centuries when the first cracks began to form. 200 years of constant expansion, of world after world, brought into the light of imperial truth, of armies beyond counting, sweeping across the galaxy to reclaim humanity's birthright from the Xenos and the degenerate, and the simple, savage darkness of old night. The Emperor himself had led us in those early years, his golden presence at the head of our fleets like a sun around which all other lights orbited, his will shaping the course of history with each decision, each battle, each world that bent its knee to the lightning bolt and the eagle. I marched beside him. I stood in his shadow. I watched as he forged an empire that stretched across 1,000,000 worlds, binding together the scattered remnants of human civilization into a single, unified whole that would stand against the darkness forever. Or so we believed, or so we were certain. The Primarchs were his greatest creations, 20 demigods crafted from his own essence, each one a masterwork of genetic engineering and warpcraft, each one designed to be a general, a leader, a son who would extend the Emperor's reach into corners of the galaxy that even he could not personally oversee. They were scattered at their birth by forces we did not then understand, flung across the stars by the machinations of entities that we had been taught did not exist, and the Emperor spent decades of the Crusade recovering them, finding each lost son on whatever world had claimed him, and restoring him to his rightful place at the head of the legion that bore his genetic legacy. Horus was the first to be found. Horus Lupercal, the Wolf of Luna, the favored son who walked at the Emperor's right hand and learned the arts of war and statecraft directly from the master of mankind. I watched them together in those early years, watched the way the Emperor looked upon Horus with something that might have been pride, might have been love, might have been the satisfaction of a craftsman examining his finest work. Of all the Primarchs, Horus was the most complete, the most balanced, the one who seemed to embody everything the Emperor had intended when he designed his sons to be the instruments of humanity's salvation. We did not see the flaw. We did not understand that the very qualities that made Horus great, his ambition, his charisma, his burning need to prove himself worthy of his father's regard, were the same qualities that would eventually damn him, damn us all, damn the dream that we had spent 2 centuries building. The emperor withdrew from the crusade in the 203rd year of its prosecution. He did not explain his reasons, did not share with us the nature of the great work that called him back to terror, did not prepare us for the absence that would leave such a void in the heart of everything we had built. He simply announced that he was returning to the throne world, that the crusade would continue under new leadership, that Horus, his most trusted son, his war master, would command the armies of the Imperium in his stead. I remember the ceremony where the title was bestowed. Remember the way Horus knelt before his father and accepted the weight of responsibility that was being placed upon his shoulders. Remember the pride that radiated from him like heat from a star. I remember, too, the shadow that passed across his features when the emperor turned away, a flicker of something that I did not recognize then, but would come to know intimately in the years that followed. It was hunger. It was doubt. It was the first stirring of questions that should never have been asked, of ambitions that should never have been permitted to take root. The other Primarchs accepted Horus's elevation with varying degrees of grace. Some, like Sanguinius of the Blood Angels and Yagatai Khan of the White Scars, embraced their brother's new authority without reservation, recognizing in him the qualities that made him suited for command. Others chafed beneath the arrangement. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, whose bitterness had been festering since long before this new indignity. Angron of the World Eaters, whose rage knew no master and tolerated no equal. Lorgar of the Word Bearers, whose faith had been publicly humiliated by the emperor and whose heart harbored wounds that had never healed. We did not see the alliances forming. We did not perceive the resentments crystallizing into something more dangerous than mere discontent. We were too confident, too certain that the bonds of brotherhood would hold against any strain, too blinded by our own success to recognize that success itself had become the fertilizer in which treachery could grow. The seeds were planted across 100 worlds, in 100 conversations, in 100 moments of doubt and disappointment, and the creeping realization that the Emperor's vision for humanity might not align with the visions his sons had developed for themselves. Lorgar had already turned, though we did not know it then, had already knelt before powers that the imperial truth denied existed, had already begun the slow and patient work of corrupting those brothers whose hearts were susceptible to the promises that the Chaos Gods whispered to those who would listen. The word-bearers spread their poison through the legions, through the army, through every institution they could touch, preparing the ground for a harvest that would not come for decades. And Horus, brilliant, charismatic, beloved Horus was listening to whispers of his own. I did not witness his fall. I was on terror, standing vigil in the corridors of the imperial palace, when the War Master was struck down on the moon of Davin and carried into the Serpent Lodge, where the priests of chaos waited to claim his soul. I learned of it only later, pieced together from reports and testimonies and the fragmentary confessions of those who had been present when the favored son of the Emperor was remade into the champion of everything his father had sought to destroy. They told me that he was wounded in battle, that a blade touched by the warp had pierced his flesh and left him dying, that his sons had carried him in desperation to a place where sorcerers promised healing that imperial medicine could not provide. They told me that he walked in visions while his body lay in fevered unconsciousness, that he saw futures and pasts and the truth behind the lies that the Emperor had told to keep humanity ignorant of the gods that hungered for its worship. They told me that he emerged from that lodge transformed, his eyes holding a light that had not been there before, his heart filled with a new purpose that would require the death of everything he had once sworn to protect. I did not believe it at first. I could not believe it. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the favored son, the greatest of the Emperor's generals. How could such a being fall? How could the light that had burned so brightly be extinguished and replaced with darkness? How could the brother who had led us to victory after victory suddenly become the enemy against whom all future victories must be won? But the reports kept coming. The evidence accumulated. The impossible became undeniable. Horus had turned against the Emperor. Horus had embraced the ruinous powers. Horus was coming, and he was bringing half the legions with him, and the war that followed would make the Great Crusade look like a border skirmish in comparison. The heresy had begun. Let me tell you what came next. The betrayals and the battles, the worlds that burned and the brothers who fell, the long and bloody road that led from the Serpent Lodge of Davin to the walls of the Imperial Palace itself. Let me tell you the story of how humanity's golden age ended in fire and treachery, how the Emperor's dream was shattered by his own sons, how the Imperium that exists today was born in the ashes of the Imperium that might have been. Let me tell you of the Horus Heresy, from its beginning to its end. I was there for all of it. I carry it with me still, and the weight of it has never grown lighter, not in 10,000 years of remembering. The betrayal began with a whisper, but it announced itself with fire. Istvan III, a world that had been marked for compliance, a simple matter of bringing another human civilization into the imperial fold, became the crucible in which the traitor legions purged themselves of loyalty, the killing ground where brother turned against brother for the first time in a slaughter that would set the pattern for everything that followed. Horus had spent months preparing for this moment, identifying the warriors within his own legion and the legions of his fellow conspirators, whose loyalty to the Emperor remained too strong to be corrupted, gathering them together under the pretense of a routine campaign, positioning them for elimination with the cold precision of a surgeon preparing to excise a tumor. I did not witness Istvan III directly. I learned of it through astropathic reports that arrived on Terra, fragmented and confused, through the testimony of the few survivors who escaped to carry warning of what had occurred, through the piecing together of evidence that revealed the full scope of what the War Master had done. But I have spoken to those who were there, have extracted from their shattered memories the details of what transpired on that world's surface, have reconstructed the events with a clarity that sometimes makes me feel as though I had stood in the trenches myself. The virus bombs fell first. 12 billion human beings died in the span of hours. The population of Istvan III dissolved into organic slurry by weapons that the Imperium had created for use against Xenos threats too numerous to defeat through conventional means. The loyalist Astartes, on the surface, sons of Horus, Emperor's children, Death Guard, World Eaters, tens of thousands of warriors who had served their legions with honor and had been marked for death because that honor could not be bent toward treachery, survived only because their armor and their transhuman physiology protected them from the plague that scoured all other life from the world's surface. And then the firestorm came. Horus ordered, the atmosphere ignited, the gases released by 12 billion decomposing bodies transformed into a conflagration that swept across the planet's surface and burned everything that the virus had not already destroyed. The loyalists who had survived the bombing huddled in the ruins of the planet's cities, watching the sky turn to fire above them, understanding at last that they had been betrayed by their own brothers, by their own primarchs, by the War Master himself. They should have died. The plan required their death, but they did not die. They fought. Captain Garviel Loken of the Sons of Horus, Captain Tarik Torgadon, Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children. These names, and others, emerged from the ashes of Istvan III as the leaders of a resistance that should have been impossible, a defiance that delayed the traitor timetable by precious weeks, while the loyalists held the ruins against repeated assaults from their former brothers. They knew they could not win. They knew they were dead men, fighting to extend their deaths by hours, by days, by whatever time they could purchase with their blood. But they fought nonetheless, because fighting was all that remained to them, because the alternative was to accept the betrayal without response, because even in the face of certain annihilation, some fragment of honor demanded that they resist. The war on Istvan III lasted for months. It consumed resources and attention that Horus had intended to direct elsewhere. It gave the Imperium time. Not enough time, never enough time, but time nonetheless to recognize the threat and begin to respond. And it revealed to the galaxy that the heresy would not be a clean thing, would not be the swift decapitation strike that the War Master had planned. It would be a war of attrition, a grinding conflict that would consume worlds beyond counting and lives beyond reckoning before it finally reached its conclusion. The survivors of Istvan III were eventually overcome. The loyalists died to the last man, their bodies left to rot in the ruins of cities they had given everything to defend. But their sacrifice was not meaningless. Their resistance sent a message that echoed across the stars, carried by the few ships that escaped the system before the traitor fleet could establish complete blockade. The Emperor's sons had turned against him. The Imperium was at war with itself, and the worst was yet to come. Istvan IV was the answer to the question that Istvan III had posed. The demonstration that the corruption ran deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. The moment when the true scope of the conspiracy revealed itself in a massacre that would haunt the Imperium for 10,000 years. The Emperor, upon learning of Horus's betrayal, dispatched 7 legions to bring the War Master to heel. The Iron Hands, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard in the first wave, with the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Alpha Legion, and the Word Bearers following in support. 7 legions, 7 sons. Surely enough force to crush even a War Master who had turned from the Emperor's light. But 4 of those 7 had already fallen. The Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Alpha Legion, the Word Bearers. Their treachery had been concealed until the moment when it could inflict maximum damage. Their loyalty feigned until the trap was ready to be sprung. The first wave descended upon Istvan V, expecting to be supported by their brothers. They found instead a killing field, prepared with meticulous care, a crossfire from which there could be no escape, a betrayal so complete that it shattered 3 legions in a single day, the Drop Site Massacre. I have heard it called this in the centuries since. The name is inadequate. Names are always inadequate for such things. Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands was the first Primarch to die in the Heresy, his head struck from his shoulders by Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, his own brother, his closest friend among the 20. I am told that Fulgrim wept as he delivered the killing blow, that some fragment of the Primarch he had been struggled against the demon thing he was becoming, that his tears fell upon the corpse of his brother, even as his hands raised the severed head in triumph. I do not know if this is true. I do not know if it matters. Ferrus Manus was dead, and his legion was broken, and the Imperium had lost one of its greatest champions before the war had truly begun. Vulcan of the Salamanders was captured, dragged away in chains to endure torments that would continue for years. Corax of the Raven Guard escaped with a handful of his sons, fleeing into the void to rebuild what could be rebuilt, to prepare for a vengeance that would be long in coming. The 3 legions that had descended upon Istvan Fai in the first wave were reduced to remnants, their strength shattered, their ability to influence the war's course crippled before they could strike a single meaningful blow against the traitor forces. And across the galaxy, the heresy spread like fire through dry grass. Horus had planned well. The corruption that Lorgar had seeded, the alliances that had been forged in secret, the resentments that had been carefully cultivated over decades, all of it bore fruit in the months following Istvan Fifuf. World after world declared for the War Master, their garrisons turning against the Imperium they had sworn to serve, their populations conscripted into the armies of chaos by leaders who saw in Horus's rebellion an opportunity to seize power they had never been permitted to hold. The ruin storm, a great wound in reality, conjured by the Word-Bearer's sorcery, split the galaxy in two, severing communication between Terra and the loyal forces that might have come to its defense, isolating the Emperor in his palace while his enemies gathered their strength for the final assault. I remember the reports that arrived in those first months, each one worse than the last. Remember the faces of my brothers as we learned of massacre after massacre, betrayal after betrayal, world after world, falling to darkness that should never have touched them. I remember the silence that descended upon the imperial palace as the true scale of the catastrophe became clear, as we understood that everything we had built across 2 centuries of crusade was crumbling, as the golden age that we had believed would last forever revealed itself to be as fragile as glass and as temporary as morning frost. The Emperor did not despair. I do not know if he was capable of despair. Do not know if the mind that had guided humanity through old night and into the light of the Great Crusade could experience such mortal weakness. He simply acted, deploying the forces that remained loyal, fortifying Terra against the assault he knew would come, working in the depths of the palace on projects whose nature he did not share with any of us. We custodians stood our vigil. We prepared for the battle that approached. We watched the galaxy burn and knew that we could do nothing to stop the burning, could only wait for the fire to reach us and meet it with golden blades when it finally arrived. The war would last for 7 years. 7 years of bloodshed and treachery and horrors that no chronicle could fully capture. 7 years of brother killing brother, of worlds rendered lifeless, of atrocities committed in the names of gods whose existence the imperial truth had denied. 7 years that would transform the Imperium from a beacon of hope into a fortress of despair, from a civilization ascending toward the stars into a species fighting for survival against enemies that had emerged from within its own ranks. I will tell you of those 7 years. I will tell you of the battles and the betrayals, the heroes and the monsters, the moments of desperate hope and the longer moments of crushing defeat. I will tell you of the road to Terra, of the siege that followed, of the final confrontation between father and son that ended an age and began the long nightmare in which we have dwelt ever since. But first, understand this. By the time the drop site massacre was complete, the war was already lost. We did not know it then. We still believed that victory was possible, that the traitors could be defeated, that the Imperium could be restored to what it had been before Horus spoke his first word of rebellion. We were wrong. The Imperium that existed before the Heresy was already dead, killed by the virus bombs of Istvan Thrun and the bolters of Istvan Fifev, buried beneath the bodies of loyal sons who had been slaughtered by brothers they had trusted with their lives. What we fought for in the years that followed was not victory. It was a survival. It was the preservation of something, anything, from the wreckage of our golden age. It was the hope that the Emperor's dream might endure, even if the dreamer himself did not. The galaxy burned, and we could only watch the flames spread. Let me tell you of the 7 years between Istvan and Terra, of the campaigns that carved bloody paths across the stars while the Emperor fortified his palace and prepared for the final confrontation that he knew was coming. Let me tell you of the battles that decided the fates of worlds, of the heroes who fell and the monsters who rose, of the long descent into darkness that transformed the Imperium from a civilization at war into a species fighting for its very survival. The burning of Prospero came first in the sequence of great tragedies, though its roots stretched back to before the heresy had even begun. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, had tried to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery. He had used sorcery to send his message, shattering wards that the Emperor had placed around the Imperial Webway project, unleashing demonic forces into the tunnels beneath the palace that would require the Emperor's constant attention to contain. The warning arrived, but at a cost so catastrophic that it nearly destroyed everything the Emperor had been working toward in his secret labors beneath Terra. And the messenger, Magnus himself, was condemned for the very act that had been intended to save the Imperium from the treachery that threatened it. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves was dispatched to bring Magnus to Terra for judgment. Horus intercepted the order, twisted it, transformed a summons into an execution warrant. The Wolf King descended upon Prospero with his legion at full strength, accompanied by the Sisters of Silence and elements of the Custodian Guard. And what followed was not an arrest, but an annihilation. The systematic destruction of a world, a legion, a primarch who might have stood with the Emperor if fate and manipulation had not conspired to drive him into the arms of the very powers he had sought to master. I was not present at Prospero. My duties kept me on Terra, standing vigil in corridors that grew darker with each passing day. But I have spoken to those who were there, have heard their accounts of the psychic fire that swept through the streets of Tizca, have learned of the moment when Magnus finally embraced the patronage of Sinch and accepted damnation rather than extinction. A primarch who had loved knowledge above all things, who had sought to illuminate the darkness rather than worship it, was transformed into a servant of chaos, because we could not see past our own orthodoxies to recognize the ally he might have been. This is the tragedy of the heresy, repeated 1,000 times in 1,000 variations. The loyal sons driven to treachery by the actions of those who claim to serve the Emperor's cause. The enemies created by inflexibility and pride, and the failure to recognize that loyalty could take forms other than blind obedience. Calth burned next, and with it, the last illusions of the Ultramarines. Robute Gilliman had believed, despite the evidence, of Istvan that the word-bearers remained loyal, that Lorgar, his brother Primarch, could not have fallen so far into corruption that he would make war upon those who had once fought beside him. This belief cost him dearly. The word-bearers descended upon the Ultramar system under the guise of joint operations, and when the trap was sprung, the Ultramarines found themselves fighting for survival against an enemy that had spent decades preparing for this moment of treachery. The Battle of Calth was a slaughter wrapped in a catastrophe. The word-bearers deployed weapons that murdered the system's sun, transforming Calth from a thriving world into an irradiated wasteland where survival required retreat into underground bunkers that would become prisons for the generations that followed. Gilliman's legion was mauled, its strength reduced by tens of thousands in a single engagement, its primarch wounded in ways that went beyond the physical. The Lord of Ultramar had believed in the bonds of brotherhood. Calth taught him that those bonds could be severed, that brothers could become enemies, that trust itself was a weapon that could be turned against those who offered it too freely. But Calth also taught the Imperium something else. that the Ultramarines would not break, that Guilliman's sons would fight with a determination that matched their father's genius for war, that the 500 worlds of Ultramar would become a bastion against the darkness, even as the rest of the galaxy fell into chaos. The underground war of Kalth continued for years, loyalist and traitor locked in endless combat beneath a dying world's surface. And though the cost was terrible, the Ultramarines endured. They would reach Terra eventually. They would arrive too late, but they would endure. The Shadow Crusade followed Kalth, Lorgar and Angron, carving a path of destruction through the 500 worlds, burning system after system in a campaign designed not merely to conquer, but to corrupt, to transform the Materium itself into something more hospitable to the gods they served. World after world fell to the combined fury of the Word-Bearers and the World-Eaters. Their populations sacrificed in rituals that fed the ruin storm and strengthened the barrier that kept the loyal legions divided, unable to coordinate, unable to bring their combined strength against the traitor advance. Angron ascended to demonhood during the Shadow Crusade, his transformation into a demon Primarch completed on the world of Nuceria, the same world where he had been enslaved, where the butcher's nails had been driven into his skull, where the seeds of his eventual damnation had been planted long before Horus whispered the first words of rebellion. I am told that his legion watched as their father was consumed by the warp and reborn as something that was no longer truly Angron, that was merely rage given form, hatred elevated to divinity. They did not mourn. The World-Eaters had long since lost the capacity for mourning. They simply followed their transformed Primarch into the next battle, the next slaughter, the next world that would burn beneath their chain axes. Cygnus Prime claimed the Blood Angels, or tried to claim them. Horus had prepared a trap specifically for Sanguinius, had arranged for the angelic Primarch and his legion to be deployed to a system where demonic forces waited in ambush, where the flaws hidden within the Blood Angels' genocide might be exploited to turn them from loyalty to corruption. Kabanda, a greater demon of Khorne, led the assault, and for a time it seemed that the trap would succeed. The black rage descended upon the Blood Angels, their secret shame exposed, their warriors consumed by visions of their Primarch's death that drove them to madness and slaughter. But Sanguinius did not fall. Sanguinius could not fall. Not there, not then. His destiny lay elsewhere, on the walls of terror and in the halls of the vengeful spirit, and whatever powers governed fate had decreed that he would reach that destiny, regardless of what obstacles chaos placed in his path. The Blood Angels emerged from Cygnus Prime, bloodied but unbroken, their Primarch's wings still white despite the darkness that had sought to stain them. They would fly to Terra. They would stand beside the Emperor in his final hour, and Sanguinius would die there, as he had always known he would die, as he had seen in visions that haunted him since long before Horus spoke his first word of treachery. The heresy ground on, year after year, campaign after campaign. Worlds beyond counting were rendered lifeless. Populations beyond reckoning were slaughtered or enslaved or corrupted into something no longer recognizable as human. The legions that had been humanity's greatest defenders became its greatest threat. Their strength turned inward, their weapons aimed at the civilization they had been created to protect. And slowly, inexorably, the traitor forces converged on Terra. The path to the throne world was not direct. The loyalist forces that remained, the scattered remnants of shattered legions, the Imperial army units that had not turned, the Titan legions and night houses that held to their oaths despite the madness that surrounded them, contested every system, every world, every void station that lay between the traitor fleets and their ultimate objective. The battles of the Heresy are too numerous to recount in full, too complex in their interweaving to reduce to simple narrative. Beta Garman, the Titan death, consumed Titan legions by the dozen in the largest engagement of god machines in human history. The Thrama's crusade pitted the Dark Angels against the Night Lords in a campaign of mutual annihilation that left both legions shadows of what they had been. The Khan and his white scars struck at the traitor flanks, using their speed to disrupt supply lines and delay advances, buying time with blood and fury for the defenses of Terra to be completed. And on Terra itself, Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists labored to transform the Imperial Palace into a fortress that could withstand the assault of gods. I watched him work, watched the walls rise higher and the bastions grow stronger, watched the killing fields take shape and the overlapping fields of fire interlock into patterns that would make any approach a gauntlet of death. Dawn did not sleep in those years. I do not think Primarchs required sleep in the way that mortals did, but even by the standards of his kind, Dawn's dedication was absolute. Every hour devoted to fortification, every thought bent toward the defense that would determine humanity's survival or extinction. He knew, as we all knew, that the walls would not be enough. No wall could stand forever against the forces that approached. No fortress could resist indefinitely when the attackers included 4 Primarchs, 9 legions, countless mortal auxiliaries, and the demonic entities that the traitors had bound to their service. The defenses of Terra were not designed to achieve victory. They were designed to buy time. Time for the loyalist reinforcements to break through the ruin storm and reach the throne world. Time for the Emperor to complete whatever final preparations he was making in the depths of the palace. Time for fate to provide an opportunity that skill and strength alone could not create. We prepared for a siege we could not win. We prepared to die, holding walls we knew would eventually fall. We prepared to meet our brothers in battle, the sons of the same emperor we had served beside for 2 centuries. The warriors we had trusted with our lives now coming to end those lives with weapons they had once turned only against humanity's enemies. And in the 7th year of the Heresy, the skies above Terra grew dark with ships, and the final battle began. I was there when the siege of Terra began. I stood upon the walls of the Helios Gate as the first traitor ships breached the orbital defenses, watched the burning wreckage of loyalist vessels tumble through the atmosphere like falling stars, felt the tremor through the adamantine beneath my boots as the first orbital bombardments struck the outer districts of the palace. I had waited 7 years for this moment, had prepared for it with every breath and every thought, had known with absolute certainty that it was coming, and that nothing could prevent it. And yet, when the moment finally arrived, when the reality of it pressed against my consciousness with the weight of a collapsing star, I found that preparation was meaningless, that no amount of anticipation could truly ready a soul for the experience of watching everything it had sworn to protect come under assault from forces that should never have been its enemies. The traitor fleet was vast beyond comprehension. Ships beyond counting filled the void around Terra, their hulls bearing the marks of legions that had once been humanity's greatest defenders. The Eye of Horus, the wings of the blood angels inverted into mockery, the symbols of 9 legions that had turned their backs on the light and embraced the darkness that hungered for humanity's extinction. Among them sailed vessels that had been corrupted into something no longer recognizable as imperial design, their structures warped by the warp itself, their crews transformed into things that wore human skin but served inhuman masters. Demon engines prowled through the fleet like predators circling wounded prey, and at its heart wreathed in energies that made even my transhuman eyes water to perceive, hung the vengeful spirit, Horus's flagship, the seat of his power, the throne from which he would direct the final destruction of everything his father had built. The Void War lasted for days. It consumed fleets that had taken centuries to construct, scattered debris across orbits that would remain hazardous for millennia, wrote epitaphs in fire and metal for crews whose names would never be recorded in any chronicle. The loyalist forces fought with a desperation that bordered on madness, throwing themselves against superior numbers with the knowledge that every hour they bought was an hour. The walls could be strengthened. Every ship they destroyed was one fewer that would rain death upon the surface. Every moment of delay was a moment closer to the arrival of reinforcements that might turn the tide. They fought and they died, and eventually they could fight no more. The traitors made planetfall on the 55th day of the siege. I watched them descend, drop pods and landing craft and assault rams, a rain of metal and malice that fell upon the outer precincts of the palace like a storm of iron hail. The first wave struck the Lion's Gate spaceport, and the battle for that installation alone consumed 200,000 lives before the sun had set on Terra's first day of ground combat. The second wave targeted the Eternity Wall, and the third the Ultimate Gate. And within hours, the entire outer perimeter was engaged. The defenses that Rogel Dawn had spent years constructing tested against the fury of enemies who had nothing to lose and everything to destroy. We held. For weeks, we held. The walls of the Imperial Palace were the greatest fortifications ever constructed by human hands, the culmination of every lesson learned across 10,000 years of warfare, the physical manifestation of Rogel Dawn's genius and the Imperium's desperate need. They were designed to channel attackers into killing fields, to overlap fields of fire until no approach was safe, to present an unbroken face of adamantine and void shields against which even Titan killer weapons would struggle to make impression. The traitors broke themselves against those walls in waves that numbered in the millions, their dead piling so high that the bodies themselves became obstacles that subsequent waves had to climb before they could reach the defenses that had killed their predecessors. But walls, no matter how mighty, are only as strong as those who defend them. And we were dying. We were always dying. Sanguinius held the Eternity Wall spaceport when it seemed certain to fall, his golden form visible from kilometers away as he carved through traitor forces with a blade that sang with each stroke. I saw him fight, saw him rally defenders who had been moments from breaking, saw him inspire acts of heroism that should not have been possible from warriors who were already wounded, already exhausted, already certain that they were fighting their final battle. The Angel of Baal was everything the legends claimed and more, a Primarch in his full glory, death incarnate to his enemies, hope incarnate to those who fought beside him. He knew he was going to die. He had always known, and yet he fought as though victory were not merely possible, but inevitable, as though his faith alone could hold back the tide that threatened to overwhelm us all. The Blood Angels fought beside their father, and they were magnificent in their fury. The black rage that had awakened at Cygnus Prime was a constant threat, a darkness lurking beneath the surface of every warrior's consciousness. But on Terra, that darkness became a weapon. Sons of Sanguinius hurling themselves into combat with an abandon that terrified even the traitors they faced, their madness channeled into a hurricane of violence that bought hours, days, precious time that could not have been purchased any other way. Rogel Dawn commanded the overall defense, his mind holding the entire vast architecture of the siege in perfect clarity, directing reinforcements to threatened sectors, ordering withdrawals when positions became untenable, sacrificing territory to preserve the forces that would be needed for the battles yet to come. I have never seen a Primarch's genius displayed so completely as Dawn's was during those weeks. Every decision perfect, every deployment optimal, every resource utilized to maximum effect. And yet even his genius could not change the fundamental mathematics of the siege. We were outnumbered. We were outgunned. We were facing enemies who could afford to lose 10 warriors for every one of ours and still have forces to spare. The outer walls fell on the 55th day of ground combat. I will not describe the fighting that preceded their fall, will not attempt to translate into words the horror of battles that consumed entire districts of the palace, that rendered architectural wonders into rubble and transformed sacred spaces into charnel houses. I will say only that when the final sections of the outer perimeter were breached, when the traitors poured through gaps that could no longer be sealed, the defenders who had held those walls for 55 days had given everything that mortal and transhuman warriors could give. They had not failed. They had simply been overwhelmed by forces that no courage or skill could have resisted indefinitely. The fighting moved inward. The inner walls became the new front line. And still we held, because holding was all we could do, because the alternative was to let the traitors reach the Emperor without opposition, because every warrior who remained knew that the moment they stopped fighting was the moment humanity's last hope would be extinguished. The Khan arrived with his white scars on the 91st day, breaking through the orbital blockade in a display of void warfare that would have been impossible for any other legion. His forces fell upon the traitor rear like a thunderbolt, shattering formations that had believed themselves secure, relieving pressure on sections of the wall that had been hours from collapse. For a brief moment, a few days, perhaps a week, hope flickered in hearts that had begun to accept the inevitability of defeat. But the Khan's forces were too few. The damage had been too great. The reinforcements that might have turned the tide, the Ultramarines, the Dark Angels, the scattered remnants of loyal legions fighting their way through the ruin storm, were still too far away. On the 137th day, Horus lowered the shields of the vengeful spirit. I do not know why he did this. The strategists who have studied the siege have offered theories that his patron gods demanded a final confrontation, that his pride could not accept victory through attrition alone, that some fragment of the sun he had been wanted to face his father one last time before the end. Perhaps all of these are true. Perhaps none of them are. The minds of those who have given themselves to chaos do not operate according to logic that the uncorrupted can comprehend. What I know is that the Emperor saw the opening and seized it. He had been waiting, I understand now, waiting for precisely this moment, for the opportunity that strategy could not create, but that faith insisted would come. The Emperor gathered his chosen warriors. Sanguinius, Rogel Dawn, a company of his custodians, a force of imperial fists. And he went to end the war the only way it could be ended. He went to face his son. I was not among those chosen. My duties kept me on the walls, fighting in battles that suddenly seemed meaningless, knowing that the fate of everything was being decided somewhere above us, in the corrupted halls of a ship that had once been the pride of the Great Crusade. I fought without thought, without hope, without anything except the mechanical execution of the skills that had been drilled into me across centuries of training. I killed traitors whose faces I did not see, whose names I would never know, whose deaths meant nothing against the scale of what was happening in the void above Terra. And then I felt it. Every psyker on Terra felt it. Every soul with even the slightest sensitivity to the warp felt the moment when Sanguinius died, felt the angel's light extinguished, felt the golden radiance that had held back the darkness for so long finally succumb to the wounds that had been destined for him since before his birth. The blood angels screamed, every one of them, a sound of grief so profound that it transcended mere vocalization and became something felt in the marrow of bones and the depths of souls. Sanguinius was dead. Horus had killed him, and the emperor faced his favored son alone. I did not witness what happened in the throne room of the vengeful spirit. No one who witnessed it survived unchanged, and those who were present have never spoken of it in detail that satisfies the questions of those who were not there. I know only the outcome. I know that the emperor and Horus fought, father against son, creator against creation, in a battle that shook the foundations of reality itself. I know that Horus, empowered by the 4 gods of chaos, wounded the emperor unto death, inflicted injuries so catastrophic that even the master of mankind's impossible physiology could not fully heal them. And I know that the emperor, in the final moment, unleashed the full measure of his psychic might and destroyed Horus utterly, not merely killing him, but annihilating his soul, ensuring that the ruinous powers could not resurrect their champion, ending the threat of the War Master forever at the cost of everything he had been and everything he might have become. The traitors felt their master's death as clearly as we had felt Sanguinius's. The assault faltered. The momentum that had been building toward final victory dissipated like morning fog beneath a rising sun. And in the confusion that followed, as the 9 legions realized that the being who had promised them victory was gone forever, the loyalist reinforcements finally broke through the blockade and fell upon the traitor rear with the fury of armies that had been fighting for 7 years to reach this moment. The siege of terror was over. The heresy was ended. And the emperor of mankind, the master of humanity, the being who had guided our species through old night and into an age of glory that had seemed destined to last forever, was carried back to his palace more dead than alive, his body broken beyond repair, his consciousness flickering like a candle in a hurricane. They placed him upon the golden throne. They connected him to machines that had been designed for another purpose entirely. Devices meant to open humanity's path to the webway, now repurposed to sustain a life that could not be sustained by any other means. And there he has remained for 10,000 years, neither alive nor dead, suffering beyond imagination, holding back the darkness through an act of will that has not wavered for a single moment since the day his sons carried him from the vengeful spirit's ruins. This is how the heresy ended. This is what it cost us. This is why we are what we are, 10 millennia later, still fighting the war that began when Horus listened to whispers he should have ignored and chose ambition over loyalty, darkness over light, the promises of gods over the love of a father. This is the truth I carry. This is the weight I bear, and it has never grown lighter. Not for a single day, not for a single hour. The emperor endures, the imperium endures, but what we lost in the fires of the heresy can never be recovered, and the golden age that might have been will haunt us until the stars themselves grow cold, and the last human heart beats its final beat against the silence of an empty universe. The scouring lasted for 7 years more. 7 years to drive the traitor legions from the worlds they had claimed, to pursue them across the stars they had corrupted, to force them at last into the Eye of Terror, where they would fester and scheme, and wait for opportunities that would come again and again across the 10 millennia that followed. The loyal Primarchs led this campaign. Guilliman and the Khan, Dawn and Russ and Korax and Vulcan, those who remained, those who had not fallen or been broken or been lost in the chaos of the heresy's final days. They fought with a fury born of grief, with a determination forged in the fires of everything they had lost, with the understanding that the work of the Great Crusade would now have to begin again, from foundations that had been shattered almost beyond repair. I did not participate in the scouring. My place was on terror, standing vigil in the corridors of a palace that had become a mausoleum, guarding the broken form of an emperor who could no longer speak or move or do anything except suffer in silence upon the throne that kept him alive. The 10,000 had been reduced to less than 1,000 by the siege, our golden ranks thinned by battles that had consumed the finest warriors the Imperium had ever produced. We who remained took up the burden of those who had fallen, expanded our vigils to cover the spaces that our dead brothers could no longer protect, and we waited for orders that would never come, for a voice that would never speak again, for some sign that the sacrifice we had made had been worth the cost it had extracted. No sign came. The Emperor was silent, and in that silence, the Imperium transformed into something that would have horrified the being it claimed to serve. The imperial truth died with the heresy. The rationalism that the Emperor had championed, the rejection of superstition and religion that had been the philosophical foundation of the Great Crusade, could not survive the revelation that gods were real, that chaos existed, that the warp was populated by entities of unimaginable malevolence, that everything the imperial truth had denied was not merely true, but actively hostile to humanity's existence. The Lectitio Divinitatus, the text that Lorgar had written in secret worship of the Emperor as a god, spread across the Imperium like wildfire through dry grass, filling the void left by a truth that could no longer be believed. The Emperor, who had forbidden worship of himself, who had burned Lorgar's perfect city to punish him for building temples in his name, became the God-Emperor of mankind, an object of veneration, a focus of prayer, a divine being whose silence was interpreted as mystery rather than incapacity. The ecclesiarchy rose to guide this worship, and the Inquisition rose to enforce it, and the Imperium that emerged from the ashes of the heresy was not the secular empire of reason that the Emperor had built, but a theocracy of fear, a civilization held together by faith in a God who could not confirm or deny the prayers of his worshippers. I have watched this transformation with eyes that remember what was. I have stood in the shadows of cathedrals built to glorify an emperor who despised such glorification, have heard hymns sung in praise of a being who wanted humanity to praise itself, have witnessed the slow calcification of everything that was once dynamic and growing into something rigid and desperate and slowly dying. The Imperium of today is not the Imperium of the Great Crusade. It is a fortress built on the corpse of a dream, a monument to survival rather than aspiration, a civilization that no longer reaches for the stars, but merely clings to what it has while the darkness presses ever closer. This is what the heresy cost us. Not merely the lives, though the lives were beyond counting. Not merely the worlds, though worlds beyond numbering were rendered lifeless. Not merely the Primarchs, though the loss of those demigods left wounds in the Imperium's soul that have never healed. The heresy cost us our future, the golden path that we had been walking, the destiny that had seemed inevitable, the transformation of humanity into something greater than it had ever been. We were going to be gods. We were going to transcend the limitations of flesh and claim the galaxy as our birthright. Instead, we are survivors. We are the inheritors of a broken dream, fighting endless wars to preserve the fragments that remain, sacrificing billions each day to keep the machinery of civilization grinding forward for one more hour, one more year, one more millennium. The Emperor's vision did not die when Horus fell. It died when the Emperor himself was placed upon the golden throne, when the being who had been guiding humanity toward transcendence was reduced to a corpse sustained by machines, when the voice that had spoken of humanity's unlimited potential was silenced forever. 10,000 years I have walked these corridors. 10,000 years I have stood vigil over a master who cannot acknowledge my service, who cannot speak the words that might give meaning to the sacrifice of those who fell in his name, who cannot do anything except endure and endure and endure while his imperium slowly crumbles around him. I remember what he was. I remember the light in his eyes when he spoke of the future he was building, the warmth in his voice when he addressed his sons, the absolute certainty that radiated from him like heat from a star. I remember believing, truly believing, with every fiber of my being, that we could not fail, that the Great Crusade would achieve everything it set out to achieve, that the darkness would be driven back forever, and humanity would inherit an eternity of light. I was wrong. We were all wrong. The darkness was not out there, waiting to be conquered. The darkness was within us, waiting to be awakened. Horus proved this. The Primarchs who fell beside him proved this. The millions of human beings who turned against the Emperor, who embraced chaos, who chose damnation over loyalty, all of them proved that the enemy we should have feared most was not the alien or the demon, but the weakness that dwelt in our own hearts, the capacity for betrayal that exists in every soul that has ever drawn breath. And yet the Emperor endures, and yet the Imperium survives, and yet, after 10,000 years of war and suffering, and the slow, grinding erosion of everything that was once great about humanity, we are still here, still fighting, still believing, still refusing to surrender to the darkness that presses against our borders from every direction. This is, perhaps, the meaning that I have found in 10 millennia of contemplation. Not that the heresy was necessary, not that some good emerged from the evil that consumed half the Imperium, not that the suffering was justified by some outcome that made it worthwhile. There is no such justification. There is no meaning that redeems what was done to us and what we did to ourselves. But there is endurance. There is the simple, brutal fact of continuation, the refusal to die, the insistence on existing, the determination to keep fighting even when victory is impossible. And the best we can hope for is to delay defeat for one more generation, one more century, one more millennium. The Emperor taught us to reach for the stars. The heresy taught us to hold what we have. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps survival in a universe that seems designed for our extinction is its own form of triumph. Perhaps the mere fact that humanity still exists, still dreams, still produces souls capable of heroism and sacrifice and love. Perhaps that is the victory that the Emperor purchased with his suffering, the legacy that justifies the broken God upon the golden throne. I do not know. I am a custodian, a guardian, a watcher in the darkness. Questions of meaning and purpose are beyond my function, beyond the role for which I was created. I know only that I was there when we were gods. I know only that I watched us fall. I know only that I remain, standing vigil over the ruins of a dream that was more beautiful than anything the universe has seen before or since, waiting for an end that may never come, or an awakening that seems less possible with each passing century. The Horus Heresy ended 10,000 years ago. The wounds it inflicted have never healed, and I carry the memory of what we were, what we might have been, what we lost. I carry it as a sacred burden, as a testament to glory and tragedy intertwined, as proof that even the greatest light can be extinguished and even the deepest darkness can be endured. This is my testimony. This is my vigil. This is the story of the Horus Heresy, from its beginning to its end. And the Emperor, silent upon his throne, neither alive nor dead, endures the suffering that purchased humanity's survival, endures it without complaint, without respite, without any hope of release. He endures, and so, in his name, do we all.